So good afternoon. Yes, and I'm very happy to be able to welcome you to ISMEO, the International Association for Mediterranean and Oriental Studies in Rome, Italy. ISMEO promotes study, research and cultural collaboration related to countries of Asia, Africa and the Mediterranean. At ISMEO, we created this music series called Oriental Music Conversation as a platform to share newest scholarly work with the members and the public. My name is Salvatore Morra and I'm the music curator of ISMEO. The conversation is recorded and it will last for about 50 minutes, after which we will take audience questions for about 10 minutes. At the end of the event, you can use the chat features on your screen to submit your questions or raise your hand and we will unmute yourself to ask questions directly. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Laudan Nooshin, who is professor of music at the University of London. Her research interests include the creative process in Iranian music, music and youth culture in Iran, music and gender, urban music studies, and music in Iranian cinema. Her publications include Iranian classical music, music and the play of power, and the ethnomusicology of Western art music. So welcome to this third conversation, and Laudan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Salvatore. Right, I'm going to start by sharing my screen, hopefully. PowerPoint there. Okay, so first I'd like to thank Salvatore and the International Association for Mediterranean and Oriental Studies for inviting me to talk today. I'm really delighted to be joining you from the UK and excited to share some of my recent work. So just to start by saying that I've been researching and writing about Iranian music for the past 35 years or so. My earlier work focused on creative processes in Iranian classical music, and I've also published on popular music of various kinds, and more recently on music and sound in Iranian cinema. I'm currently writing a book on the sounds of Tehran, and I also have long-standing interests in gender issues, something I'll be exploring today. I should also say that I have a reputation for talking too fast, so please stop me and make me slow down if I'm going too fast. I'm trying to cover a lot in 15 minutes. There has to date been relatively little scholarly work on Iranian film that engages directly or primarily with sound, and I'm interested in how a sonic perspective troubles and destabilizes the normative focus on the visual. So I'll be talking about two films today: The Law Girl, Dokhtare Lor, the earliest Persian language sound film made at the Imperial Film Company in Bombay in 1933, and a more recent film, The May Lady, by one of Iran's foremost female directors, Rashan Bani-Etamad, released in 1998. And I'll be talking about both films, but my main focus will be on The May Lady, Banuye Ordibehesht. Film arrived in Iran following the first state visit to Europe of Muzaffer-ad-Din Shah, when at the Paris Exposition Universelle of 1900, he encountered the cinematograph. Captivated by the moving images, he ordered his court photographer to purchase one to be taken back to Iran. Screenings initially provided entertainment for royalty and aristocracy, but film soon entered the wider public domain, where it faced opposition both on religious grounds and due to political sensitivities leading up to the 1906 constitutional revolution, which forced the closure of Tehran's first cinema hall soon after opening in 1905. Despite objections, film gradually became established, and by the early 1930s, there were 15 cinemas in Tehran and 11 in the provinces. The first full-length Iranian silent film, Abi o Rabi, was made in 1930 by Iranian-Armenian Ovanes Ohanian, who had also established the first film school in Iran in 1925. And the first sound film, The Law Girl, was made in Bombay in 1933. A great deal has been written about The Law Girl. Hamid Nafisi, for instance, the film scholar, Iranian film scholar, writes in detail about the film's reception in Iran, where it was first screened at the Mayak Cinema in Tehran on the 20th of November, 1933. Just got a poster of the first screening, with the audience reportedly breaking into applause on hearing Persian spoken on screen for the first time, despite some complaints about the Indian accents. The film tells the story of Gulnar and Jafar. Gulnar is a young woman abducted as a child from a respectable urban home by the Lord tribal chief, Qoli Khan, and forced to work in the remote Caravanserai roadside inn of one of his informants, Ramazan. Jafar is an undercover government agent who has been sent to the tribal areas to infiltrate Qoli Khan and his gang of highway bandits. Gulnar and Jafar fall in love and she eventually escapes with him. The narrative can be understood in the context of Reza Shah Pahlavi, an army general who'd seized power in a coup in 1921 and later crowned himself king. Reza Pahlavi's attempts at this time to disempower local tribal leaders in favor of centralized state power, and his promotion of a particular vision of nation, Vatan, as modern, industrialized, secular, and Persian-centric. And this in the context of Iran's centuries-long history as multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, and multi-faith. Many of the discourses that were mobilized by the Pahlavi regime depended on a series of binaries which set itself apart from its others, its modernity versus the regressive traditionalism, or what was presented as the regressive traditionalism of the preceding Qajar monarchs, secular versus religious, urban versus rural, civilized versus uncivilized, nation versus tribe, and so on. In The Law Girl, we see these binaries starkly portrayed in the lawlessness of the tribal regions versus the order and civilization of central control, represented by the figure of Jafar, and later by images of colonial Bombay, where he and Gulnar seek refuge. But I'm particularly interested in a sub-narrative of the film that traces Gulnar's journey from low-class entertainer to educated woman, and which also serves to symbolize Reza Shah's reforms, and specifically how this is marked through music. So the first Persian language sound film starts with music, accompanying the opening credits, and we'll listen to this in a moment. But it soon becomes apparent that this is in fact the diegetic sounds of a music band playing for the Caravanserai guests and accompanying Gulnar's dancing. So yeah, I'll just describe the opening scene for you and then I'll play a bit of it. The first image that we will see is a close-up of Gulnar's gyrating hips from where the camera pans slowly up to her face. Such intimate bodily images and the direct female gaze would have been very provocative for the time, with clear implications for the immorality of the dancing girl and her perceived sexual availability, here symbolic of tribal backwardness. The music itself is also strongly marked as non-Persian other through Arab instruments such as the darbuka goblet drum and also the oud, the lute. And note also that the musicians wear Arab clothing and headpieces. Gulnar is encircled by an audience of guests who clap to the music and encourage her dancing. We also see the leering gaze of the sheikh, who later pays Ramazan to spend the night with Gulnar. So let's just watch the first minute or so of the film. And I do apologise for the poor quality. The version of this film that's available on YouTube is not great quality, unfortunately. So I'm just unsharing that so that I can play the first minute or so of the film. Hopefully you won't get any adverts. So I'm told by Salvatore and Priscilla, who were looking earlier, that you may get some distortion at the beginning of the film, but I'll just play and fingers crossed you'll be able to see.
Sorry, Laudan. Either you share again, you come out.
Can't see it. You can't see it at all.
No, because we are out of the sharing now.
Oh, hang on a minute. That's because I haven't shared my screen. Now I'm sharing the screen. Sorry about that. Okay, let me just take it. I might need to take it back a few. Can you see it now? Okay, all right, try again. Okay, and there's the sheikh there. So I hope you were able to see at least make some sense of what was going on the screen there. So keep these images and sounds in your mind. In fact, the entire film is framed by this opening scene and another musical scene towards the end, which I'll discuss in a moment. Sandwiched in between them is the main action, essentially comprising Gulnar and Jafar's escape from Gholi Khan, their pursuit by his men, and their eventual flight from Iran to Bombay by boat. Music, both diegetic and non-diegetic, is heard throughout. So I'd like to compare what we've just watched with the penultimate scene of the film. So fast forwarding. Many years have passed since Gulnar and Jafar's escape from Gholi Khan and their arrival in Bombay, and there has in the meantime been a change of regime back in Iran. The passage I'll describe follows a series of intertitles that inform the viewer of a coup d'etat, that is, the February 1921 coup that brought Reza Pahlavi to power. And these intertitles list the achievements of the new regime: economic stability, national security, expansion of trade, establishment of industry, promotion of women's rights, and so on. From this, we move into a scene which starts with a close-up portrait of Reza Shah hung on a wall, to the background sounds of domestic piano playing. And again, I'll describe the scene and then I'll play it. As with the film opening, the music initially seems non-diegetic until the camera pans down to show Gulnar at the piano, transformed by way of modern European clothing and cropped hair. And there's an interesting symmetry here with the earlier example where the camera pans up from her dancing hips to her face that we've just seen. In the scene that we're about to see, the camera pans down. It moves down from the portrait of Reza Shah to the back of Gulnar's head. And there's a significant contrast with her direct gaze that we saw at the opening. It isn't until her husband arrives that we actually see her face. So in this scene, the piano as an instrument arguably symbolizes an assemblage of interconnected ideas around modernity, technological progress, colonial authority, urbanity, cultural capital, class, and economic power, and crucially in the context of Reza Shah's modernizing reforms, indexing European refinement and quote-unquote civilization. Jafar, wearing a Pahlavi hat and European tie, arrives at home, climbs the stairs of their comfortable home, and we'll see servants busy cleaning, and he commends Gulnar on having learnt the piece well. He asks her to play the song that he, quote, taught her yesterday, and he launches into a patriotic song in praise of Reza Shah to Gulnar's accompaniment. This is the first point in the film, in fact, where the central protagonists make music together. They've made a lot of music separately during the film. This is the first point where they come together. The lyrics of the song tell of a country that is prosperous, strong and free, ancient but wrought anew. So I'm just going to play you a couple of minutes of the beginning of this scene that I've just described. Probably from about there.
گرفتی ها اون آهنگی که دیروز به جا دادم بزن جناب بس بکنه خیلی خوب ملک خسروی آباد و آباد و همطبیع ملک کهن یافته نوی از پرتو دور پهلوی قدرت کهن.
Okay, I'll just stop it there. The brief final passage that follows this shows Jafar and Gulnar reading newspapers under a tree as they discuss and finally decide to return to Iran. These final scenes complete Gulnar's transformation from a captive dancing girl to an educated, newspaper-reading, piano-playing modern woman. At the same time, her usefulness can arguably be measured in relation to the needs of the patriarchal system, as an accompaniment to her husband, for example. So I'm just going to stop sharing here and go back to the PowerPoint slides. Can you see the screen now? Yeah. Sorry, I need to re-share, don't I? I keep forgetting to do that. Okay. So, what does all this tell us? Women were central to Reza Shah's modernization project, and Gulnar's metamorphosis can be understood as part of the, quote, secular and radical modernist discourse that called for the social, political and cultural modernization of Iran and that considered certain changes in gender roles to be desirable factors of modernization and westernization. Women were to become educated and made modern in the service of the nation and existing patriarchal structures. Not only does the film's title draw attention to the central female character, the film's called The Law Girl, but from the start, Gulnar is made visible in one of the most public and religiously objectionable ways possible as a dancing, singing entertainer. By the end of the film, social order is re-established and her performance, now invested with social and cultural capital, becomes contained within its proper domestic sphere. As Claire Cooley has observed about this passage, Gulnar's near silence in this scene and attentive listening contrasts dramatically with the presence of her voice in the previous scenes, where she argued and negotiated with the bandits, sang solos, confidently flirted with Jafar, and talked with him about the differences between notions of love in the modern city and the countryside. Now nearly silent in terms of her voice, but providing musical accompaniment to Jafar's nationalistic song through the piano, Gulnar demonstrates the more limited, essentialized femininity of the new modern middle-class woman. So I want to argue here that Gulnar's bodily transformations lie at the intersection of debates about gender, nationhood and modernity in Iran, and resonate with the idea, also found elsewhere, of women as embodying the ideal of the modern nation. And music is clearly implicated in how this message is communicated in the framing scenes of the film. Janet Al-Ferry discusses the widespread anxieties about women's changing role in early 20th century Iran, including the introduction of secular education. She says the aim was not to encourage critical thinking, but to shape loyal citizens who were devoted to the Shah and his rule and were peacefully integrated into the new modernizing society, and to curtail the extensive authority of the ulama, the religious authorities. At this time, women's bodies became the site of political struggles, and modernization also instituted new disciplinary practices with respect to women's bodies. End of quote. Such disciplinary practices continued, of course, and found new forms after the 1979 revolution. The Law Girl was a landmark in Iranian film history. The first sound film to be made in Iran, Tufan Zendagi, which means The Storm of Life, directed by Ali Daryobegi, wasn't made until 15 years later in 1948. Interestingly, this film also opens with an on-screen musical performance, this time in a concert hall. The centrality of music in film continued for several decades until 1979, after which music became somewhat marginalized. So now I want to move on and fast forward to another important moment in Iran's recent history, the reform period that followed the election of President Mohammad Khatami in May 1997. I'm aware that in doing so, I necessarily bypass several decades of Iranian cinematic history, but I believe there are interesting insights to be gained by comparing the role of music and sound in The Law Girl with the 1998 film The May Lady by Rashan Bani-Etemad. So The May Lady tells the story of Forough Kia, a filmmaker who's been tasked with making a documentary film about a quote unquote exemplary mother, which she's been commissioned to make this film. And we follow her as she travels around Tehran, interviewing women from all walks of life. Forough is a single mother who lives with her teenage son Mani, and she is torn between her sense of duty and social expectations of her as a mother and her desire to enter a romantic relationship, which Mani is fiercely opposed to. So I want to explore three interrelated themes in my discussion. Firstly, Forough's positioning as an empathetic and gendered listener in ways that were unprecedented in Iranian cinema at the time. Second, I'm interested in how The May Lady goes beyond the purely metaphorical deployment of female voice as a symbol of agency to actively foreground the intensely material and embodied sounds of women. Finally, I consider the ways in which the viewer is invited to listen in on and share the sonic intimacies of Forough's daily rituals. You will perhaps have noticed a shift here from my earlier focus on music to a broader consideration of sound. Music was hugely problematized in government discourses following the 1979 revolution, and what we saw from the 1980s was a marginalizing of music in Iranian cinema for various reasons, aesthetic, social, and political. Several writers have noticed the sparse aesthetics of many post-1979 art house films, no doubt related in part to their generally neo-realist ethos, often including a reduced musical and sonic palette. Nonetheless, sound continued to play a central role, but this has gone largely unnoticed due to a tendency to fetishize the visual and other dimensions such as political and social commentary, both on the part of censors and scholars. In studying The May Lady, I became interested in what an attention to sound might reveal, particularly the kinds of messages hidden within the sonic. So first then, The May Lady is a film about listening, in particular from the very opening scene when Forough films street children in a poor neighborhood of South Tehran. She becomes positioned as an empathetic listener. One of the striking features of The May Lady is the sheer number of voices and perspectives that we hear, primarily through Forough's filmmaking and her encounter with voice after voice through interviewing, editing, and transcribing. In other words, the structure of the film itself allows for an amplification of these voices through what might be called double listening. The audience experiences these voices through Forough, and we attend to them in ways that are shaped by her responses. This double listening arguably facilitates a more concentrated attention on such voices as they are put into what we might call the listening frame that accords them value. The message is that we may learn something from those who normally barely register in the cacophony of national debate. So I'm going to describe some scenes from this film and play some extracts, and I strongly recommend this film if those of you are interested in Iranian cinema, if you want to watch the whole thing. So what I want to suggest is that this focus on the performative act of listening in the film draws attention to the power relations at play in terms of who listens to whom and who has the authority to listen and be listened to, and that this acts as a subtle under-the-radar challenge to patriarchal listening frames. At the same time, our listening is also contingent on Forough's mediating role as gatekeeper. We hear these voices because she has selected them. As an educated middle-class professional, Forough commands a level of respect and authority that is in part marked through the ways that her colleagues and others listen to her. But her status is also precarious and provisional. The moment her voice is detached from that status, she is just the sound of another woman, as we observe in a scene where she is making telephone calls to arrange interviews with government officials and other public figures, incidentally whilst also doing her housework. One office that she phones assumes that, since she's a woman, she must be a secretary calling on behalf of a male filmmaker. Forough responds, and I quote, "Does anyone who calls you who is a woman have to be a secretary?" Whilst disembodiment can in some contexts be empowering, it can also work to fetishize, in this case, the female voice, as the single defining feature of the sound-producing body. It may be no coincidence that a film about listening and listening to women should have been made at a time when the national discourse in Iran, under Khatami's leadership, promoted notions of civil society, to which listening to others is central. And this was also a time when gender norms and expectations were increasingly being challenged in the post-1997 reform period. The individual stories that Forough encounters in the film start to consume her to the point of obsession. From the single mother married at 16, divorced at 25, to the woman widowed in her 20s and who, with 3 children, has educated herself through night school and is now aiming to go to university, to the mother who lost one son to the Iran-Iraq war and who has for many years devoted her life to caring for her other paralysed son, to the woman queuing every week to visit her son in prison on charges of drug smuggling, and on and on. What is most striking from the first interview that we hear is the quality of listening. As Forough sits in the privacy of her living room, sifting through photographs of the many women she's talked to, whilst listening to an interview with one Behjat Bordbar Azari. Again, I'll describe the scene and then we'll watch it. At first, we see Forough making notes. She then pauses to listen more intently, placing one hand under her chin and the other against her head. Then sighing as she brings her closed fists up to her mouth. It is significant that we first hear Behjat's disembodied voice before the film cuts to a flickering low-quality video recording of her as the setting shifts to Forough's workplace, editing room. The unbroken voiceover provides a smooth transition between the 2 spaces. The camera cuts between images of Forough, deep in thought, and the screen that she is watching. What is of interest here is not just how Forough's intense performance of listening invites the audience to share the oral experience with her, but this invitation extends to a sharing of her emotional journey. From this interview, Forough fast forwards to another on the editing machine, and within seconds we are transported to the actual interview on a terrace. Once again, the unbroken voiceover provides the transition between on-screen and live presence. Now in direct dialogue with her interviewee, we see Forough respond and smile. There are some interesting class and ethnic issues here. The interviewee introduces herself as Taghizadeh in Azari, marking her as being from Iranian Azerbaijan, most likely a 1st or 2nd generation migrant. Forough asks her to continue the interview in Persian, but the opening serves to alert the audience to the sounds of ethnic otherness. Taghizadeh's chador clothing indicates her lower social class, but she is not so religiously observant as to wear a black chador. It turns out that Taghizadeh is a formidable woman who, despite social and financial hardship as a widow and single working mother, has managed not only to ensure the education of her 3 children, but has herself attended night school and is preparing to take university entrance exams. At this point, Forough cannot resist exchanging a glance with her son, Mani, who she had previously admonished for taking his privileged middle-class educational opportunities for granted. Education as a route out of poverty and dependence for women is a central theme in Bani Etamad's films. So I'm going to now play the whole of this passage that I've just described so that you can get an idea of it. Now, what did we decide? Did we decide Vimeo was better, or I can't remember now. Was it the Vimeo one?
Yes.
Okay, let's try it. So I'm just going to.
Vimeo was better.
Yeah, I'm just going to line it up. Sorry, I just find the right extract here. It's a couple of minutes long.
در سن 25 سالگی مطالعه کردم و 3 تا بچه خودم دادگاه به من داد با کار و تلاش شبان.
Wait, is not share the screen.
I will learn this one day.
Okay, now yes.
It says I'm screen sharing. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see now.
So I just need to take it very slightly forward. It's quite hard to get exactly the right point. Oh, okay. I think it's all right here.
بهجت بردبار آذری متولد 1319 در سن 16 سالگی ازدواج کردم به علت مشکلاتی که تو زندگی پیش اومده بود. در سن 25 سالگی مطالعه کردم و 3 تا بچه خودم دادگاه به من داد. با کار و تلاش شبان روزی که انجام دادم این بچه‌های من به عرصه وجود رسوندم. علت کار تلاش زیاد داره که دوست داشتم با عاشقش بودم. یه روزی به عنوان کارمند نمونه زن معرفی شدم. یه روزم که بیمار بودم در خونه بودم. بعد از اینکه رفتم اداره روز که بود که روز زن بود، کمتر که مشغول دیدن برنامه بودم و معرفی مادرها، یک مرتبه گفت که شما به عنوان مادر نمونه اداره هستی.
من تقی‌زاده هستم، 3 تا فرزند دارم. بعد یکیش دندون پزشکی میخونه، یکی داروسازی خونده، یکی کوچیکم دانشگاهه. شوهر من 23 سال فوت کرده. بعد خودم زحمت کشیدم، تو کارخونه کار کردم، دیگه نمیدونم همه جا کار کردم و بعد دیگه تولیدی و بیمارستان و اینا. بعد دیگه الان خودم هم نهضت سواد آموز دیپلم رو گرفتم، میخوام لیسانس هم بگیرم.
پس تصمیم دارید تو کنکور هم شرکت کنید
اگه خدا بخواد.
چه سال.
It's interesting that in the course of these two interviews, the film moves seamlessly from the privacy of Furugh's flat to the semi-public space of the editing suite and then out into the more public world, but still within the confines of Taghizade's home, the publicness marked by the audience of onlookers from an opposite window, who presumably can't hear the sounds heard by the film audience. This movement marks different degrees of privacy and publicness that are so integral to the conceptions of space in Iran, and is also mirrored by the move from audio only in the flat to video recordings in the editing room and the final live interview. What stays constant is sound in the narrative of the two women, which arguably mediates the blurred boundaries between the real and the documentary aspects of the film. So what I suggest is that Furugh engages in a very particular kind of empathetic and affective listening encountered repeatedly throughout this film, one that facilitates a new kind of filmic intimacy that had rarely been experienced before in Iranian cinema, and which might be termed a cinema of empathy, to which sound is absolutely central. So I'm just going to play one more example to illustrate this point. And this is, as I say, one of many examples in the film. This extract that I'm going to show you shows Furugh in a war cemetery, filming a mother who lost her son in the Iran-Iraq war. And again, just note her empathetic response to the woman's story.
بعد که رفتیم چیز پزشک قانونی دیدم که یه همسادی منقضی جنازه بردن، اون همونطور گشت من سوادنار شمون سوادنارش همونطور یه دفعه یه کشو کشید گفتیم هادی. بعد دیدم که بچه من تو هم بعد دیگه همونجا افتادیم. بعد اومدیم یه بردار دفتر این تشت جنازه کردن و بردن تو محل و دیگه خیلی سر دوم من سال اونو داده بودیم هادی رو. یه روز دیگه گفت آقا من میخوام برم جبهه دیگه. همین تا گفت ما همه گریه کردیم. بعد محمود ما که الان چیز شده رفت اونجا خبر گرفت ما گفت آقا هادی حسن همشهش.
جای من در صف بی انتهای مادران حماسه ساز کجاست؟
Stop it there. To move on to my second and related point about the May Lady, what is very noticeable is both the sheer quantity of female vocal sound, a large proportion of the film's soundtrack is of women, and the very particular qualities of those sounds. The only male voices heard regularly are those of Furugh's son, Mani, and the disembodied voice of her lover, Dr. Rafa. It's interesting to think about what kinds of subjectivity are engendered through this sonic foregrounding, such that the female voice operates not just metaphorically as an index of agency, but in very tangible ways through a form of sonic saturation. This proliferation, excess even, offers a sensorial experience that works alongside, but is subtly subversive compared with other more overt projections of female agency, as I will describe. There is, of course, a considerable literature exploring issues of voice, agency, and gender, including in relation to film. In Iran, there are particular sensitivities around the alleged power of the female voice, which has generated a set of official discourses and controls in the public domain. and that are also rooted in traditional social and cultural norms and expectations of gendered behaviour. Since the 1979 revolution, such discourses have focused, for example, on solo female singing, which has been prohibited in public other than to all female audiences. Group singing is allowed, but with certain and variable stipulation on the numbers of singers. Such controls, argued in the name of religious propriety, are in reality assertions of patriarchal power structures. Restrictions on solo singing is one of a number of controls, but has taken on particular significance due to the myriad ways in which it can and has been challenged, and because of its symbolic silencing of women. The reasons given for prohibiting solo but allowing group singing are revealing and pertinent here. Group singing, it is claimed, cancels out the individually heard vibrations and nuances of the female voice, which allegedly have the potential to arouse lustful thoughts and bodily desire. There is no doubt some element of arbitrariness in such restrictions, evidenced also by inconsistencies and contradictions elsewhere in the public domain. But such discourses tap into deep-rooted anxieties about the power of the female voice that go well beyond Iran, and which can be found in stories such as the Greek sirens and other femme fatales. In other words, there is something about the timbral and other qualities of the sung voice in these widely circulating ideas. And it's interesting to note that such restrictions do not extend to speech. To the contrary, it's quite normal to hear the spoken female voice in all areas of public life in Iran, including on national media, theatre, and so on. Only solo singing is marked out as dangerous and needing control. What this means then is that in the absence of official restrictions on the spoken voice, the May Lady operates within a perfectly legitimate framework, and Bani Etemad is able to push this sonic dimension to its limits without risk of sanction. This subtle provocation reveals the many ways in which quiet voices can speak back to larger structures of power. So quiet voices brings me to Forough herself. As well as her central role as listener, Forough is also the most important voice in the May Lady. One of the most striking features of her voice, and that sets the tone from the start, is its calm and quiet, understated quality that contrasts with many earlier female protagonists in Iranian cinema. Her voice is also pitched relatively low in the female vocal range. All of these help to construct Forough as a character who is well-grounded, stable and reliable, as well as adding to her aura of authority and empathy that I've discussed. Such qualities are shared by some of the other female voices in the film, including those who have much reason to feel aggrieved at life and whose emotions of sorrow, anger, resignation, and so on take on particularly embodied sonic form through the process of voicing. It's interesting to consider here what the sound of a voice communicates above and beyond the semantic meanings of words. This is what Roland Barthes famously terms the grain of the voice, a useful shorthand to indicate the meeting point of timbre, texture, contour, vibrancy, and the many other qualities that contribute to the uniqueness of each voice. Amanda Weidman has written about the separation of voice into its semantic components and the sound itself, with the former, the semantic, tending to be privileged in discussions of meaning. In other words, we may miss a great deal if we focus solely on what is being said, as opposed to the sonic qualities of voice. And certainly in the May Lady, the materiality and grain of voice, of Forough's and of others, communicates a great deal. I've so far focused on Forough's professional life, but what about the sonic intimacies of her private life? Throughout the film, the audience is invited to experience aspects of her daily routine, including the sounds of domestic labour, such as cooking and cleaning. Early in the film, we see her return from work and start to prepare the evening meal. Sound becomes a truly visceral experience through the gushing tap water as Forough washes the carrots, the sharp click of the knife on the chopping board as she slices mushrooms and then scrapes them into a bowl, and the frying of onions and tomatoes. For much of this passage, Forough's visual presence is reduced to her hands, and there are no other sounds or verbal interactions. This heightened focus on domestic sounds serves both to frame Forough once again as a listener, as well as drawing attention to her juggling of professional life and domestic responsibilities. I'll just play that passage. It's quite a short passage. The film is punctuated by further scenes that foreground the sounds of home and domestic work, as well as Foroug's exercise routine as she jogs and walks in the hills around her home. Though short, these latter scenes are important in providing Forough with a space for reflection and are largely devoid of sounds other than those of her own body. We hear her footfall on the path, crunching the autumn leaves, and her panting as she stops and doubles over to catch her breath. Here's one short example of that. I just need to fall. Like many Iranian art house directors, Bani Etemad uses relatively little non-diegetic music in her films. In The May Lady, music, where it is heard, is always diegetic, with one exception, and always in domestic settings or spaces that link Foroug's public and private worlds, notably the interior of her car and the stairwell of her apartment block. Instead, so rather than music, other devices are used by way of a substitute soundtrack, particularly in transitional passages where music might have played a continuity role. Almost every such passage in the film is set to a voiceover of Foroug's reflective thoughts, extracts from love letters, the voices of interviewees, or the sounds of driving. Perhaps the most striking and effective example of this substitute soundtrack, and which serves also as a vehicle for sonic intimacy, is in the communication between Forough and her lover, Dr. Rahbar. In the face of censorship rules that prohibit physical contact between male and female actors, rules that present challenges for portraying close relationships, Bani Etemad has, like other Iranian filmmakers, and I quote here from Michelle Langford, found ways of indirectly suggesting moments of tenderness, intimacy, and even eroticism through allusions, metaphor, allegory, and other forms of suggestive imagery, end of quote. In the 1995 film Rusari Abi, The Blue Veiled, for instance, Bani Etemad uses shadows creatively to suggest intimacy. In The May Lady, Foroug's contact with Dr. Rahbar is entirely sonic, by way of telephone conversations and letters. The lovers never occupy the same physical space, and the viewer only sees Dr. Rahbar once, briefly from a distance. Bani Etemad effectively responds to the state censors by apparently accepting the restrictions, but then taking them to an extreme, almost as a challenge, by avoiding any simultaneous physical presence entirely. Instead, she creates a feeling of intense sensuality by shifting intimacy into another domain, the sonic, and transforming Forough and her lover into what might be called acoustic bodies. As such, the voiceover of poetic love letters, and I'll play an example in a moment, the voiceover of poetic love letters takes on immense significance, with thinly veiled allusions to Foroug's namesake, Iran's foremost female poet, Forough Farrokhzad, who she's named after. In using poetic writing in this way, Bani Etemad draws on a centuries-old tradition of using poetry as a vehicle for hidden messages in Iran, one that has unsurprisingly found its way into cinema. This intriguing aspect of the film has attracted the attention of a number of scholars. Hamid Nafisi, for instance, notes the weaving together and shadowing of the voices. I'll play an example in a moment. The weaving together and shadowing of the voices in ways that parallel some of the structures of Iranian classical music, particularly sections where a solo instrument shadows and embellishes the vocal line at a short distance. In the same way, or a similar way, we hear Forough and Dr. Rahbar's voices weaving in and out of one another, sometimes one ahead, sometimes slightly behind, occasionally dropping out entirely. For viewers who can read its significance, the two voices layered over each other opens up possibilities of iconic eroticism that go well beyond what is permitted by legal and social modesty rules, and is arguably as powerful as any open display of intimacy. The lovers may be prohibited from touching, but they become metaphorically bonded through sound. So this is my last example. I'm just going to play an extract of the voiceover of Love Letters. Just need to take it back slightly.
گیرم. چه کسی میگوید که عشق من و تو به قیمت حذف سهمی از عزیزان ماست. بی تردید واکنش غزل دختر من کمتر از مانی تو نیست. ولی این چه قانونی است که من تو در نیمه راه زندگی زیباترین حقیقت بودنمان را انکار کنیم. گذشته هر روز شروع هر فصل یادآور روزگاری است که بی تو بر من و بی من بر تو می‌گذرد و حسرت لحظه هایی که به تردید از دست می‌رود.
Discussing Bani Etemod's poetic filmic device, Nafisi notes the, quote, unequal veiling rules, by which, end of quote, by which censorship focuses almost exclusively on the visual. So interestingly, it turns out that sound per se does not evoke the same sensitivities and anxieties that music does, and therefore largely evades sensorial scrutiny. But modesty rules that fetishize the visual ignore the very materiality of sound, thus missing the point that the sonic is as much a form of physical penetration as the visual gaze, arguably more so. Bani Etemod thus cleverly uses sound to aestheticize a hidden transcript as she confronts the normative privileging of patriarchal vision. Where the visual gaze is limited or prohibited, the lovers listen to one another. Where it can't be made visible, earthly love is made audible. In this way, the all-enveloping poetic sounds become an extension of Furu and her lovers' bodies, allowing for the expression of desire in ways that fly under the sensorial radar. So I'm just going to conclude now. I'm just going to go back to my PowerPoint, and I'm going to finally learn how to share my screen properly again. Okay, so to conclude, sound and music have received relatively little attention in scholarly work on Iranian cinema. And so I ask what might be revealed by our greater attention to the sonic. In particular, as a vehicle for creating, and I quote here from Ben Winters, a shared subjectivity between film audience and character, end of quote, sound is an important means by which film is able to generate a sense of intimacy, affective subjectivity, and embodied listening. In the case of the two films I've discussed today, although made in quite different socio-political historic circumstances, in both the musicosonic becomes a means for both constructing and contesting gender norms and expectations. As is often the case, women and their changing roles become a touchstone for wider social change. In The Law Girl, music comes to symbolize such changes in the form of Gulnar's transformation to a modern subject and the mobilization of women in the service of the patriarchal national frame. 65 years later, Bani Etemod pushes against that frame, but her challenge and provocation is much more subtle. In The May Lady, women and their bodies are centered through sound, and Bani Etemod is able to do this in large measure because the attention of the censors has been so focused on the visual and on what is being said that they have paid little attention to what the materiality, quality, and timbre of film sounds communicate to the listener. Audiencing The May Lady becomes a somatic experience and sound a playground for trying out new ideas away from the panopticism of the state. We hear this in the excess of female voices and in the sonic as a site of female sensual pleasure. From captive dancing girl to professional filmmaker, we've come a long way, whether foregrounding the authoritative female listener who is a role model in empathetic listening, saturating the voice track with female sounds, or offering an alternative to a musical soundtrack that weaves together female and male voices on equal terms. Bani Etemod's vision of womanhood is no longer one in service of nation, patriarch, son, or lover. Rather, it is one that recognizes her own desires and sets out its own conditions on her own terms. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you.
Now.
Oh, thanks for the out of frame. Thank you.
That's nice. I can see the audience now.
Okay. Yes. Thanks again, Laudan. Thanks ever so much for this wonderful talk. There's some really fascinating things that come up. No, I'm really taken by your sort of sound listening approach. So how music extends sentiments and beyond the meaning of semantic texts, places, practices, and the body. So things that are typically associated with films. And where on the one hand there is this idea of movement, talking, and speech, and on the other hand this private emotionality. So again, sentiment and melancholic introspections. And it seems that the woman voice that challenged, this structure power into Iranian society. And so if anyone wants to ask a question, you can raise your hand and we can unmute yourself and ask the question directly, or you can easily pop up just a question or a note in the chat feature. And sound for me is, I mean, all this idea of the cinema and the speech becoming a sound for me, who are not Farsi speakers, so I don't understand Farsi. So the language, the speech becomes even more just the meaning of sound. That's what I experienced through listening the actual video. And there's also another perspective that to be taken into account. Yeah, maybe there is a question in the chat, so you can. I know that I have to leave. It's Giovanni that has to go. Thanks, thanks for coming, and again, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And I'm very much interested into this in the first film in the law, this structure of power and this passage between from the tribe to the modernization, and especially about after the revolution, the 1978 revolution, how the revolution has changed this modernization with respect to the woman's body that Jaout Al-Fari you quoted means.
Sorry, in relation to tribe and nation, or specifically in relation to gender?
To gender, yeah, to the body, to the woman's body, how that in cinema, how that the revolution changed it.
Within cinema, or more generally, yeah.
Within cinema.
This is a very, very big question, obviously. More generally, I would say, that there is a kind of, I think, an irony, and I'm sure there's people in the audience here who could probably participate in this discussion and say perhaps more than I, because my focus is much more on the sound and the music than I haven't worked specifically on gender representation more generally in post-revolutionary cinema, but thinking about the ways in which women have carved out a space, and really a space of empowerment within the as filmmakers particularly, is really quite extraordinary. In terms of representation, I think film has really been a vehicle in many ways and for foregrounding women's agency. But I think this varies. So Rashon Bani-Etamad is one of the foremost filmmakers who's really focused on not just women's issues, social. Her films are very much focused on different kinds of social issues, but she has very much focused on women's women's stories and empowerment of women. Yeah, I don't know if anyone in the audience who knows maybe more about this area wants to contribute to.
Yeah, is this a cinematic genre or a unique example? So the May Lady, is this an entire genre of Iranian cinema, or there are a few examples of this kind of approach to gender?
I'm not aware that it's been defined as a genre as such in its own right, but there are, not an insignificant number of films now that address issues around women's place in society in various ways. So Rashan Beni-Atamad was one of the first, so she was kind of one of the pioneers. And there's a generation of younger filmmakers now who are dealing with some of these issues. So there are I'd say a large number of films that tell the stories of women from different perspectives. But as I say, it's not something that I haven't studied gender in cinema in great detail to be able to authoritatively answer that question. Yeah.
Thanks.
No questions from the audience. Everyone's very quiet. You can turn on your cameras now if you'd like to.
Yeah, so we can see all each other.
Ah, okay. Some faces coming. I mean, because I don't know who the audience is, I don't know if there are people in the audience who perhaps have knowledge of gender issues in other cinema traditions who might have comparative thoughts to offer, or particularly the role of sound in that.
It's not my case. I just open up the camera because I know how awful it is to speak in front of no one.
No, it would be nice to see some faces, but it's fine if people want to keep it.
But unfortunately, I don't know anything about the topic, so it was fantastic to listen to your speech and learn a lot. But I have no knowledge about not gendering me in film or music and film. It's something that is not in my field work normally, but I'm interested. It was really fascinating, and the example you gave were perfect. So I could understand and follow everything you were saying, but I have no questions because I'm not enough inside the topic to make some.
I mean, I would really, for those who are interested in, as I say, but Beni-Atamad, she doesn't just deal with women's issues, but more generally social issues. I would really recommend her films, and this one in particular is one of my favourites, as you can probably tell. And it is I think it's available on various platforms. There is an Iranian video platform. I think it's called IMV Box, that you can just, it's a subscription, but you can also just pay to watch one film. There are probably other platforms that you could just pay to watch as well.
From the perspective of the reception of the film and from the listener, I mean, how the relationship between the film, the aesthetic of the film, and the listening protocols, the extension of this cinematic mode, how listening into other media like music or sound interact with each other, and how it has been perceived into Iranian society.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole question of how one conducts ethnographic work with audiences is quite a complicated one, and that's why much film scholarship hasn't really done that. I think there's probably a lot of need for more ethnographic work within film music work, screen music. So I'm not entirely sure. I know that the film did receive screenings, and I think this was one of her films that won some awards abroad as well. I mean, that's another question, is the different audiences, because there is a bit of a divide in Iran between the films that are sometimes branded festival films, the films that are more sort of directed to the kinds of things that festival juries like, for example, and don't necessarily have as much of an audience in Iran. So there is a bit of a divide. And actually, Beni-Atamad is one of the directors who has managed to kind of bridge that, in the sense that she has won awards abroad for her work, and she's been very successful in that sense, but also has an audience in Iran, because I think partly because of the issues that she deals with. So that hasn't answered your question, but it's a very good one, and one that I think deserves more work. So I suppose my interpretation of what I'm reading this film is really from my perspective as an audience. I mean, kind of you know, I haven't actually spoken to audience members about how they're understanding it. Yeah.
And how much this approach to sound into cinema, into Iranian cinema, is linked to your new research on sound in the city of Tehran? Is there a link or a connection or approaching to sound between the two?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of my move away from a focus on music to more of a focus on sound more generally, definitely. And I guess, you know, this is part of a bigger trend within ethnomusicology and the kind of coming together of ethnomusicology and sound studies, and a lot of ethnomusicologists sort of becoming more interested in sound. So the book that I'm working on there is a chapter in it which is about representations of the city in Iranian cinema, the sonic representations of the city. So that will be part of it, in fact. But again, Bani Etemad is a good example of a filmmaker whose films tend to be set. So she started off as a documentary filmmaker, actually, and makes both documentary and feature films. And the vast majority of her films are set in Tehran. So that also becomes a very interesting repository for looking at the changing sounds of the city. So there's a film called Centralization, which she made in 1985, Tamarkoz, which is a good way of like looking at the kind of how the sounds of the city have changed, because you've got the filmic representations there as well. So yes, there's definitely a connection between the two. And I'm also, you know, accessing historical video footage of trying to understand how the sounds of the city have changed over time. The problem with the very earliest video footage obviously is silent, so there's no sound. And then later, what you tend to get with later video footage is, particularly with things like newsreels, tend to have other sounds put on top of them, so you can't always hear the sounds of the city, which is what you want to, but at least, you know, you can see visually what's happening and maybe deduce to some extent what's happening. So yes, there's definitely a link there.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks. Thank you. And in the second clip, the actual sound was a bit low when we heard the piano playing. I could follow the melody. I couldn't follow the melody very well, and I expect it was a sort of a European Western song or piano piece.
Yeah, I think that was the intention. Yeah, unfortunately, there are very few records about. I'm trying to find out whether the Imperial Film Company, like, what's in their archive, because there's very little information on. There's quite a lot of music in The Law Girl, but it's very hard to find out what the music was. Was it specially composed? Did that piano piece, for example, and actually the song that Jafar sings. There's more information. There definitely, but I think the intention was very much to frame it as a European style.
Yes,
you know, and that's what's the piano. The piano becomes the kind of symbol of this kind of the modernizing, the modern woman in the domestic sphere. And of course, I mean, I have a published article about this in which I go into much more detail about the symbolism of the piano in the domestic sphere in the 19th century. In 19th century Europe, of course, it was very important symbol of female domesticity. So that because the film was made in Bombay, full screening in Iran, but it was also, I know it was screened in Bombay. I haven't been able to find out where else it was screened. So those notions of female domesticity and the link with the piano would have been very familiar, at least to the audiences in colonial Bombay, definitely.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah. You see, you expect that it was also screened into the colonial context. Into the country, into the both countries.
Yeah. And there's another very interesting dimension about the fact that the Imperial Film Company, which was one of the biggest film makers of, it was the first company to make Hindi film, was actually run by Ardashir Irani, who was a Parsi, so Zoroastrian, whose family would originally have come from Iran. So and at that time, there were very strong connections between the Parsis in Bombay and intellectuals in Iran, and a real thirst for past movement in both direction. Actually, people who went to Iran, who went to Bombay to study Zoroastrian culture because they felt it had somehow been preserved more there, because obviously Zoroastrianism is practiced in Iran, but with the advent of Islam, obviously things changed. So there's a whole other, there's lots of layers actually to this film from that perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, religion, I expect that it played a lot also before the revolution and after.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, it seems we have no questions, so
yeah, so
that's fine. I hope it, for those who don't speak English, I hope I wasn't speaking too fast and it was understandable.
It was nice sound for the not just semantic of the English. And yes, I mean, if we maybe have we have time for one or two more questions. Yeah, you can just raise your hand.
Since nobody's asking a question, I'll say one more thing about, so the Gulnar, the woman who played Gulnar, was the wife of one of the studio employees in Bombay. She actually was from Kerman, so which is a city in southeast Iran. She had a Kermani accent. So she was playing supposedly a law girl, but actually her accent was Kermani. And apparently it became very popular in Iran after the film was screened. Hami Nafisi has written about this, and that people would sort of imitate her accent, and it became quite fashionable. Although apparently in later life, things became very difficult for her because her family objected to the fact that she appeared on screen, and she actually, when she went back to Iran, got a lot of backlash because of having appeared on screen, because it wasn't an acceptable thing for a woman at that time. So again, there's these other layers, but in terms of the sound of her voice, it is quite interesting. I mean, I didn't have time, obviously, to go into all of that, and I wasn't really focusing so much on voice in terms of the law girl. But I think it is interesting what also gets lost when somebody who doesn't know that background or the culture hears it, because, well, the sound quality is so poor now anyway that it's really hard to hear. But, if you're someone from Iran who knows those accents, then you would immediately, although the accent no doubt has changed since the 1930s. But that's also quite interesting.
Yeah. But do the man and the woman play a duet song together in the movie, or they just play songs separately?
No, so there's one place so there's lots of bits where they sing separately. And then they're on the boat when they travel from Iran, from the south to Bombay, they sing, but they don't sing together. They sing one by one, so they're still separate. So the song that I played you at the end is the first time where they actually perform together. And that's what I'm saying about the significance of the fact that it's not, it's Gulnar is accompanying, she's the support, she's accompanying her husband. There's something very symbolic, I think, there. And she's become domesticated effectively. This thing about kind of being in the service of her husband and so on. There's a comment
in the chat.
Thank you, Mitra John. I hope it was understandable. So I think it's interesting, The Law Girl, because it's a very well-known film. I mean, people know The Law Girl. It was the first sound film. A lot of people know the name. When I was doing the research, I discovered that many of the people I spoke to in the course of, I didn't do ethnographic work, but, just contacting people for different kinds of information, it turns out actually that very few people have actually seen the film. So it has this kind of reputation of being, the first film with sound in Persian. So, I don't know if the Iranians in the audience have actually seen it or not, but it's like almost everyone has heard of it, but not that many people have actually seen it. It's on YouTube, and it's quite a fun watch, actually. Oh, Anna, the time difference. That's happened to me recently as well. It's being recorded, so you can watch it if you're interested. Thanks for coming anyway. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, Laudan. If there is something else you want to add, please.
No, just thank you for having me, and thank you for coming. And if anyone has any questions that they were too shy to ask, then please feel free to email me. If you Google me, you'll find me very easily. I'm happy to answer questions by email, or any feedback or thoughts. Or, I mean, the nice thing about questions is that often it prompts, it makes you think about things that you might not. So I'm happy to receive any comments afterwards as well.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for being with us with this mail. Thanks for that.
Anna, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I don't know how we can reach to the recording of this meeting. Sorry, because I'm late, but I want to ask this. Is it possible we have to follow you in any special page, or how we can reach to the recording of this meeting?
Yeah. Salvatore, is the recording link going to be sent to people who registered?
Yeah, be ready to watch tomorrow, from tomorrow on, and we will send it to Laudan. And if you're in contact with Laudan, she can forward to you, or you can write to his mail.
And
his mail at EU, and we will send you directly the link.
The video will be available also on the YouTube page of Ismail and the Facebook page of Ismail, so you can access really easily.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Great. Well, have a nice evening, everyone, whatever time zone you're in.
Thank you, Laudan.
And have a nice weekend. All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.